Hello and welcome back. I want to apologize for not being so constant in the videos, but we live in a very convulsive world. Anyway, thank you very much for being here. This story is called Ugly Boy. There was a very beautiful young woman who had always dreamed of being a model. After finishing college, she found work in the fashion industry, modeling clothes for style magazines. As her career progressed, she went on many photo shoots in a variety of exotic countries. On one of these photo shoots, she was paired with a very handsome male model. They were both very attracted to each other, and one night they kissed. Soon, the beautiful and handsome pair began dating, and they gradually fell in love. After a few years, they decided to get married. At the wedding, everyone complimented them, telling them that they made a gorgeous couple. Some of the guests said that they were so good-looking that their children would certainly be beautiful. Before long, the wife was pregnant, and the happy couple looked forward to starting a family and spending a wonderful life together. However, when the baby was born, the couple were horrified. It was the ugliest baby anyone had ever seen. The doctors and nurses were speechless. They couldn't even bear to look at the baby. The mother and father had to stop themselves from vomiting whenever they caught sight of the disturbing face of their infant son. As the years passed, the baby boy grew older, and his face grew more and more ugly. His eyes bugged out. His nose was deformed and the skin around his mouth was rotting. By the time he was 3 years old, he was hideous, and his parents kept the little boy hidden in his bedroom. They never allowed him out of the house and refused to let their relatives, friends, and neighbors ever set eyes on him. The good-looking couple were ashamed that they had given birth to a child with such a repulsive and monstrous face. The strain of having such an ugly child took its toll on their marriage. The couple spent most of their time fighting and arguing. Trapped in the house every day with her hideous son, the wife began to lose her mind. Whenever she looked out the window, she would see other children playing gleefully together and was filled with resentment. Her deranged mind began to develop murderous intentions. One day, the father decided that spending so much time hidden indoors was not healthy for his wife and son. He suggested that they should go for a picnic at a nearby lake. That day, they drove out to the lake and selected a nice spot by the edge of a cliff for their picnic. Their ugly son said he needed to go to the toilet. The mother told him to pee over the side of the cliff. When the boy was close to the edge, he pulled down his zipper. Suddenly, his mother reached out and pushed him off the cliff. The father was horrified, but then a strange look passed between the married couple. He seemed to understand what she had done. Without a word, the parents packed up their picnic basket and blanket and drove home. They had finally rid themselves of the ugly boy. When their neighbors asked them about their son, they simply said that he had died after a long illness. A year later, the wife became pregnant again. Initially, the couple were worried that they would be cursed with another ugly son. However, their fears proved unfounded, because when the baby was born, they were delighted to discover that it was a beautiful baby girl. The child looked just like her parents. Unlike their first child, the parents loved and nurtured their little girl. They were so proud of her that they showed her off to their friends and neighbors. The family spent many happy years together. Time passed, and the little girl was almost 4 years old. She told her parents that she wanted to go on a boat ride for her birthday. On the day that she turned 4, the parents drove out to the nearby lake with their beloved daughter. The day was very sunny, and they rented a boat and sailed out across the placid waters. They were in the middle of the lake when the girl said, "Mommy, I need to pee." The mother helped the little girl to take off her panties. After checking that nobody was looking, she lifted her daughter up and held her over the edge of the boat so that she could go to the toilet. The little girl looked back at her father and said, "Don't let Mommy drop me this time." The next story is called The First Day of School. The first day of school is always nerve-wracking for any student. My first day at a new school was an absolute nightmare. I was 14 years old, and my family had just moved to a new town, moved home. My dad had been offered a job with better pay, and a mere week later, we had sold our house and rented an apartment in the town we moved to. It was during the summer we moved, so it was simple starting at my new school. On the first day, I walked alone to the school. I was nervous about having to make new friends. When I arrived, I picked up a timetable and saw that my first class was mathematics. It was in room 104. I began walking down the hallways, searching for the room, but the school was like a maze. Eventually the bell rang, and the students made their way to their classrooms. In less than a minute, the corridors were deserted. I stopped in front of a pair of old-looking wooden double doors. I pushed, and with the scraping sound of metal on wood, they opened. I found myself in a corridor that was old and dusty. The lockers were all hanging open, and the stench of mold and damp hung in the air. I was about to turn around and go back the way I came, when I noticed the numbers on the classroom doors. 100, 101, 102. I began walking down the hallway, but when I peered through the windows of each classroom, they were empty. Then I came to room 104. I peeked through the window. All of the students were sitting at their desks. The teacher was standing at the blackboard, and class was in session. I quietly opened the door and went inside. None of the other students paid any attention to me. I started to apologize awkwardly for being late, but the teacher just turned her back on me and began writing on the board. Turning red from embarrassment, I hurriedly found a free seat at the front of the classroom and sat down. The teacher had already written her name in chalk on the blackboard. It was Mrs. Taylor. I was nervous and self-conscious, so I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Throughout the class, I just kept my head down and concentrated on solving the maths problems. Eventually, after what seemed like hours, the bell rang and the class ended. The other students scrambled out of their desks and ran out the door. I looked at my watch and was shocked to see that it was already 3 p.m. The school day was over, and I had only attended one class. I walked down the corridors trying to find the exit. All of a sudden, I heard someone calling my name and looked around. There was a teacher making his way towards me, and he had a frown on his face. "You. Yes, you. You've the new boy, aren't you?" he said. Yes," I replied. "Where have you been?" he demanded. "I've been searching for you all day. Why didn't you go to your classes?" "But I was in class," I protested. "Which class?" he demanded. "Mrs. Taylor's class," I replied. "Room 104. The teacher's eyes grew wide and he flew into a rage. "I suppose you think you're pretty funny, don't you?" he shouted. "Well, you're not. It's no laughing matter. Now get out of my sight." I was very confused, and on the long walk home, I kept wondering what I had said that got him so upset. As soon as I reached my house, I turned on my laptop and went online. I started searching for the name of the school and the teacher, Mrs. Taylor. What I found scared me to my very soul. There were old news articles about a terrible massacre that happened in the school 10 years before. One morning, bright and early, a crazed gunman had simply walked into the school and started shooting. He stood at the doorway of a classroom and shot the teacher. Then he picked off the students one by one until every single person in the class was lying dead in a pool of blood. There were pictures of the classroom where the murders happened. I recognized it immediately. It was room 104. There were also photos of the victims. I recognized them too. Trembling with fear, I gazed at the smiling faces of Mrs. Taylor and all of the students I had been in class with. I felt sick to my stomach. My hands were shaking and a chill ran through me. I spent all night trying to convince myself that it wasn't true. The next morning, I was too terrified to go back to school. I broke down and told my parents what had happened. At first, they thought it was just nerves. But eventually, after I had refused to go to school for a whole week, they gave in and enrolled me in a different school. I managed to get on with my life and tried my best to forget all about the incident. I almost succeeded. This morning I received a letter in the mail. There was no stamp on the envelope and no return address. It had been hand-delivered. When I opened it and read the printed card inside, my hands started shaking again. It was an invitation to a class reunion, and it was signed from Mrs. Taylor. This story is called A Cry in the Night. This is a true story, and even now, years later, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. When I was 19 years old, I worked as a counselor in a summer camp. It was really gorgeous, with wooden cabins and a lake. But it was in the middle of nowhere. The camp was surrounded by dense woods. There was nothing but trees and canyons, and the closest town was over 20 miles away. One night, when everyone had turned in and was sleeping soundly, I was suddenly awoken in the middle of the night. It was one of those times where you wake up and you have the feeling that something is not quite right. My heart was racing for no apparent reason. I just lay there quietly, listening intently. The whole cabin was wooden, with fly screens over the windows so I could hear the sound of crickets and the breeze blowing through the trees. That's when I heard it. A very faint cry for help. It sounded like it was coming from the woods. It was the cry of a young girl lost somewhere out in the woods. I quickly got out of bed and woke my roommate, who was another counselor. I told him to listen. And when the cry came again, we both heard it. We quickly got dressed, grabbed our flashlights, and hurried outside in the direction the sound was coming from. It was intermittent, but I could clearly hear the girl's voice saying, "Help!" or "I'm lost," quite regularly, and quite a way into the woods. She sounded like she was in a lot of distress. The quicker we found her, the better, so we could get her back to camp safely. It was dark as hell that night, and all we had to light our way were 2 puny flashlights. The girl was out there in the pitch black with no way of seeing anything at all. The boys' cabins were on one side of the lake, and the girls were on the other. On the way, we ran into a female counselor. She had heard the cries too from her side of camp. All 3 of us headed into the woods together, shining our torches left and right, and calling out to the lost girl. We were reluctant to go too far into the woods, because we didn't want to get lost in the darkness. Whenever we called out to the girl and heard her respond, it sounded like she was quite far in. After walking for about 5 minutes, we could hear her crying and sniffling, so we knew we were close. It sounded like she was only a few feet away, and we could hear her saying, "I'm scared. Where am I?" in a low voice. We kept trying to reassure her, and just when we felt we were right beside her, she suddenly went silent. "We're here. Where are you?" we called out, but there was no answer. Then, in the distance, we heard her voice again, crying, "Help me, I'm lost, come quick." We started toward the sound of her cries, and just when we felt that we were right on top of her again, She went silent. We called out to her. We waited for her reply. Nothing. Then, from even farther away, we heard her voice again. "Help! Why can't you help me?" Something didn't feel right. We all looked at each other, and without a word, we decided to head back to camp. We called out to the girl and told her we were going to get help and we would come back with a search party. We could still hear faint whimpers and crying sounds from her, so we told her to sit tight and we would be back soon. The three of us sprinted back to camp and rang the big bell at the main office to alert the whole camp that there was an emergency. The camp manager switched on the floodlights and we all met in the quad for a roll call and a head count. They started by calling the names of the counselors. We were all present. Then they called the names of the campers. All of the kids were present. Nobody was missing. They went through the roll twice and 3 times. Every single person that was meant to be at the camp was checked off and present. But what about the voice of the girl? The camp manager and the other counselors thought it was a false alarm and said that what we had heard must have been just the echoes of our own voices. They dismissed everyone and sent us back to bed. The 3 of us knew what we had heard, and it wasn't an echo. It was creepy as hell. The voice kept leading us into the woods, further and further. Someone or something was luring us deeper into the woods, and to this day, I have no idea what it intended to do to us. This was by far the creepiest thing I have ever experienced. Myself and the female counselor believed it was something paranormal, but neither of us could explain it. The counselor who was my roommate refused to talk about it, and whenever we brought it up, he would say it was just voices echoing, but when I looked in his eyes, I could see that he was scared to death. He just wanted to convince himself it didn't happen.